the record begins not with a battle. It begins with a sound. Fleet Analyst Verath of the Dominion 7th Cataloging Division heard it first through the acoustic sensors of the observation deck. A frequency no instrument aboard the Endless Patience was calibrated to recognize. Not a weapon, not a distress signal, not any known form of communication. It was singing. Coming from the wreckage. The colony had been reduced to orbital debris field classification 9, complete structural annihilation, no recoverable architecture, atmospheric burn confirmed to 93%. Standard post-pacification assessment. Verath had filed 41 such reports in the last cycle. He was not troubled by them. But the singing continued. Single voice, unaugmented, rising from a field of carbonized metal and frozen atmosphere where nothing, according to every sensor aboard the ship, could possibly be alive. Verath flagged the anomaly in his log. He labeled it instrument malfunction pending review. He was wrong about that. He would realize it eventually. By then, it would already be far too late. The Dominion Eternal Empire had not intended to destroy the human colonies out of malice. Malice implied emotional investment, and the Dominion had long since engineered emotion out of its administrative class. What happened to the 17 outer colonies of the Terran frontier zone was simpler, and in many ways worse than malice. It was paperwork. 3 cycles prior, a boundary survey vessel had transmitted coordinates for the frontier zone to the Central Expansion Bureau. The Bureau cross-referenced those coordinates against the active expansion register and found no recorded civilization. The human settlements, 17 colonies ranging from 6,000 to 400,000 inhabitants, had failed to register under the Dominion Species Recognition Protocol, not because humans were unknown. They were known, cataloged, rated as a Class C emerging civilization on the non-interference observation list. The problem was the registration window. Humanity had submitted their Frontier Zone territorial claim forms 2 standard cycles late. The Bureau's automated systems had flagged the late filing, suspended the application, and routed the entire Frontier Zone for Standard Expansion Protocol 7. Survey, assessment, and if inhabited, relocation notice. The relocation notice was transmitted. Humanity received it 41 days after the first colony was already gone. 12 more colonies were destroyed in the interval between transmission and receipt. The final 4 were destroyed while the Terran diplomatic vessel was still crossing Dominion-controlled space, carrying the human ambassador and a full delegation, traveling to request an emergency hearing that had already been approved 6 days before anyone thought to tell them. When the Dominion Expansion Bureau filed its internal review, the error was noted, assigned a correction code, and forwarded to the Administrative Remediation Department, which would respond within 2 to 4 standard years. The human ambassador, a woman named Director Sayoni Tuilagi, received this information in a waiting room outside the remediation office. She sat with it for 11 seconds. Then she asked the escort officer a single question. "How many of your staff work in this building?" The officer blinked all 4 of his visual membranes in sequence, the Voreth equivalent of a confused frown. Approximately 6,000. Why? Tuilagi looked around the waiting room. She looked at the ceiling, the floor, the walls. She looked at the windows. Then she said very quietly, "No reason." She was escorted to her assigned quarters. That night, the escort officer filed a routine notation. Human delegation leader expressed unusual environmental interest. No threat behavior detected. Monitoring unnecessary. He was also wrong. Here is the first thing the Dominion did not understand about humanity. They assumed that when a species loses something irreplaceable, rational behavior is grief followed by negotiation, petition, and eventual acceptance. This is how every advanced civilization in Dominion records had processed catastrophic loss. petition, protest, generational healing, gradual reintegration. They had 44 prior case studies supporting this model. Not one of them was human. The Dominion's Cultural Assessment Division reviewed Director Tuilaga's file. She had survived the Kepler famine at age 7, a supply chain collapse that killed 60% of her colony's population in 4 months. She had been found, after the rescue ships arrived, caring for 11 other children in a collapsed storage structure, having rationed the food herself, kept them warm, kept them alive, for 31 days. The Assessment Division noted this in her psychological profile under exceptional individual resilience, statistically non-representative. They did not wonder what it meant that humanity had sent exactly this woman to represent them. They did not wonder who was being left behind while she crossed the galaxy to sit in a waiting room. They did not wonder about the ships. Fleet Analyst Verath's anomaly report sat in the processing queue for 4 standard days before anyone looked at it. When Senior Cataloger Dresch finally reviewed it, he immediately dismissed the instrument malfunction theory. Instruments aboard the Endless Patience were triple verified. They did not malfunction. He pulled the acoustic recording himself. The voice in the wreckage was singing in a language the Universal Translation Matrix recognized as pre-modern Terran vernacular, a genre the database identified as folk ballad, origin approximately 400 years prior to current Earth reckoning. The song appeared to be about a place called Galway Bay. The translation rendered it as a coastal body of water on humanity's homeworld. The song was expressing a desire to return there, to watch the sun set over it, to hear the wind blow across it. Dresch sat with the recording for a long time. Then he called Verath. "There is a survivor in the debris field." "Impossible," Verath said. "Atmosphere burned, the surface temperature reached." "I know what the temperature reached. There is a survivor." A pause on the line, then how? "That," Dresch said slowly, "is what concerns me." They sent a retrieval pod. What they found was a human male, approximately 40 standard years by Terran reckoning, floating in a void suit that had been dead for what the thermal decay analysis later estimated as 19 hours. The suit's oxygen system had failed. Its heating element had failed. Its distress beacon had failed. The man inside was alive. His core body temperature was 11 degrees below the human survivable threshold recorded in the Dominion's xenobiological database. His blood oxygen was at a level the database categorized as *incompatible with consciousness. His heart, which human biology required to beat approximately 60 to 80 times per minute, was beating at 9. He was still singing. Not loudly, not continuously. In fragments between what the medical scanner identified as a breathing pattern that should not have been generating enough oxygen to sustain neural function. When they brought him aboard the Endless Patience, the medical team spent 12 minutes attempting to determine if he was actually conscious before one of the junior attendants simply leaned in and spoke directly to him. "Can you understand me?" The man's eyes opened. They were dark brown, and they focused with a clarity that the attendant found immediately deeply uncomfortable. "Yeah," the man said, "I understand you. You should be dead. I know. How are you not?" The man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling of the medical bay. Then he looked back at the attendant. His voice, when he spoke again, had changed, not in tone, not in volume, but in something that the Dominion's emotional analysis software would later flag as unclassifiable affective resonance. "Because I'm not done yet," he said. His name, according to the identification chip embedded in his left forearm, was Cormac Dolly, colonist, third-generation frontier resident. Born on the world the Dominion had designated Survey Object 7 Creche, which humans had called New Munster. New Munster had been destroyed 11 days ago. The colony's population had been 112,000. Cormac Dolly was, as far as Dominion sensors could determine after a full sweep of the debris field, the only survivor. He did not behave the way the Dominion expected a sole survivor to behave. He did not weep continuously. He did not speak about the dead. He did not ask for news of other colonies or petition for rescue missions or demand contact with Earth. He ate the food they gave him. He slept. He exercised in the medical bay, structured, deliberate, progressive exercise, the kind a person performs when they are preparing for something physical. The medical team reported this to Fleet Analyst Verath as unusual adaptive behavior, species-typical grief suppression likely. Verath did not disagree. He filed the assessment. He did not yet understand that grief suppression and something else entirely can appear identical from the outside. On the 14th day of Cormac Dolly's involuntary residence aboard the Endless Patience, he asked to speak with whoever commanded the ship. Commander Oreth agreed to the meeting, mostly out of curiosity. Cormac was escorted to the command conference chamber, a room designed with deliberate architectural authority, ceilings that rose 7 meters, walls lined with cataloged conquest documents, the implicit weight of institutional power in every surface. Oreth sat at the head of a table that could have seated 40. Cormac Dolly sat across from him, alone, in a borrowed medical jumpsuit, and looked around the room with the same quiet, measuring attention the escort officer had noted weeks earlier about Director Tuilagi. "You destroyed my home," Cormac said. "The Expansion Bureau issued a legitimate." "I know what the Bureau issued. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm informing you." Oreth's secondary vocal membranes vibrated, the Voreth equivalent of a patronizing smile. "You are informing me." "Yeah." Cormac's eyes moved around the room again, ceiling, walls, windows, door. "I want to know one thing, the ships that came, the processing fleet, whatever you call it. How many were there?" Oreth saw no reason to withhold navigational history. 11 vessels, standard expansion protocol formation. Cormac nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. 11, he said. He didn't say anything else. He asked to be returned to Medical Bay. Oreth allowed it. Later, reviewing the conversation, Oreth noted it as survivor exhibiting non-threatening delusional fixation, psychological damage consistent with traumatic loss, no actionable concerns. The number 11. The commander had not understood why the man wanted it. He did not understand that Cormac Dolly had just confirmed something, that the number was not a detail he was processing. It was a report. The acoustic sensors of the Endless Patience detected a new anomaly 12 hours later, not from the debris field this time, but from deep space. Bearing 7 relative, distance approximately 14 light minutes. Multiple objects moving. Verath checked the readings 3 times before he accepted them as instrument verified. Then he checked the size classifications. Then he checked them again. He went to Commander Oreth immediately. "There are ships," he said. "Ours?" Oreth asked. Verath's skin patterning. The Voreth autonomic response system, impossible to control voluntarily, shifted to the pale gold-gray of deep unease. "No," he said. "Civilian traffic, Terran colony ships." "No." Oreth looked at his analyst. "Then what?" Verath placed the sensor report on the display surface. He let Oreth read the size classifications. He watched the commander's skin pattern shift to match his own. "That cannot be accurate," Oreth said. "I have triple verified." "Humanity does not have." Oreth stopped. He looked at the display again. Then he looked at the door to the corridor that led to the medical bay. He thought about a man in a borrowed jumpsuit asking for the number 11. He thought about what the number 11 meant if it was a report. "How long have those ships been there?" Oreth asked. Verath pulled the trajectory analysis. Based on their current position and approach vector, they have been in passive transit through this system for approximately, he checked the calculation, 31 days. 31 days. The colonies had been destroyed 26 days ago. Commander Oreth stood very still. They were already coming, he said. Yes. Before the colonies fell. Yes. The room was quiet. Both of them were thinking about the same thing, arriving at it from different angles, landing on the same terrible conclusion. These ships had not been sent in response to the destruction. They had been sent before anyone outside Earth knew destruction was coming. Which meant someone on Earth had known. Which meant the question was not, why did humanity send a fleet? The question, the real question, the one that made Verath's skin pattern shift from gold-gray to the colorless white of genuine fear, was, what else did they know, and how long have they been preparing for the answer to be no? The Dominion Central Authority received Orath's emergency transmission at 3:40 Internal Standard Time. The message was brief, because Orath was a precise officer who had spent 40 years learning to summarize crisis with accuracy. He transmitted 4 facts. Fact 1. A Terran military fleet of unprecedented scale had arrived at the location of Survey Object 7 Creche. Fact 2. The fleet's approach trajectory indicated departure from Terran space approximately 31 days prior. Fact 3. The Dominion's own cultural database had zero record of humanity possessing a military fleet of this classification. Fact 4. The fleet had not communicated, had not maneuvered aggressively, had not powered weapons. The fleet was simply there, in a holding position 7 light minutes from the endless patience, enormous and silent, the way a geological formation is silent, the way a mountain range is silent, not because it has nothing to say, but because it has no need to say anything yet. The Central Authority's first response, transmitted 4 hours later, instructed Commander Orath to attempt communication with the Terran fleet, request their stated intentions, and remind them that the expansion protocol action had been a legally authorized administrative procedure now under remediation review. Orath looked at this instruction for a long time. Then he went to the medical bay. Cormac Dolly was doing pull-ups on a structural support beam he had apparently repurposed from its intended function. He dropped to the floor when Orath entered, not with the startled reaction of someone interrupted, but with the composed ease of someone who had heard the door and decided they were ready. You knew, Orath said. Cormac reached for a water container. Knew what? The fleet, you knew they were coming. Cormac drank, he didn't answer. How long has Earth been building that fleet? Another silence. Then Cormac looked directly at the commander with the same unnerving focus the junior attendant had noticed on the first day. The focus that did not waver and did not perform, and did not carry any of the emotional signals Vorath psychology associated with vulnerability. Tell me something, Cormac said. In your Expansion Bureau files, when you identified our frontier zone and ran it through the registration system, when you found our application 2 cycles late, did anyone at the Bureau actually look at why it was late? Orath had not known there was a reason. The filing error was. There was no filing error. Cormac's voice was level, quiet, factual in the way a geological survey is factual. The application was held, deliberately, by our government, by people who looked at your expansion rate and your administrative protocols and your remediation timelines and made a calculated decision. Orath went very still. They held the application, Cormac continued, to create a window, to give the Bureau time to act, to give the Dominion time to make exactly the kind of mistake it just made, because humanity needed a reason that the rest of the galaxy would recognize as legitimate. He put down the water container. We've been building that fleet for 60 years, Commander, since before I was born, since before my parents were born. You want to know how long we've been preparing for the answer to be no." He looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, something had changed in his expression. Something that Orath's emotional analysis software was completely unable to categorize. "The question you should be asking isn't how long we've been preparing. The question is how long we were hoping we wouldn't have to be." The Dominion Cultural Assessment Division, when they eventually received and processed Commander Orath's full report along with the medical team's complete file on Cormac Dolly, would spend 16 days in emergency session attempting to reconcile the data. They had classified humanity as a Class C, emerging civilization. Class C civilizations did not build 60-year strategic military programs disguised as administrative filing errors. Class C civilizations did not plant sole survivors in debris fields as intelligence-gathering mechanisms. Class C civilizations did not possess strategic patience measured in generations. The Assessment Division's senior analyst, a Vorath named Preth who had spent 90 years categorizing alien behavior patterns, eventually stood up from her chair in the middle of the 16th session and said something that would later be quoted in every subsequent document about the Terran engagement. "We didn't misclassify them because we lacked data. We misclassified them because the category we needed didn't exist in our system." No one asked her what category she meant. Everyone in the room already understood. The Terran fleet did not attack. This was the second thing the Dominion did not understand. When the Endless Patience transmitted the Central Authorities' communication, formal Dominion diplomatic protocol, recognition of the fleet's presence, request for stated intentions, the response came not from a flagship, not from a military frequency, but on a civilian diplomatic channel. From Director Sayoni Tuilagi, who was still, technically, in the Dominion Administrative Remediation waiting room on the Central Authorities' homeworld. She had composed her response before the fleet's existence had been publicly acknowledged, before the Dominion knew it knew about the fleet. The timestamp on her message predated Orath's emergency transmission by 9 hours. She had anticipated the transmission sequence. "Dominion Central Authority," her recorded voice said, in flawless standard Vorath, with an accent that the linguistics analysis identified as deliberately acquired, learned specifically rather than translated through software, the kind of accent that takes years of practice. "I want to begin by acknowledging what you're experiencing right now. You have encountered something your records did not prepare you for. That is uncomfortable. I understand that. We have spent a long time understanding discomfort." A pause. "The fleet will remain in holding position. It will not fire, it will not advance, but it will not leave, and we would like to discuss at your convenience what comes next." The message ended. Commander Orath played it twice. The second time he focused not on the words but on the tone, the same impossible, categorically unclassifiable tone he had encountered in the medical bay. Not rage, not grief, not threat, not diplomacy in any register his cultural training recognized. It took him 3 hours to locate the closest analog in his experience. It was the tone of someone who has already accepted a cost, has already processed what the cost will mean, and is now simply waiting for the other party to catch up. The fleet was 817 vessels. This number, when it was confirmed by the Dominion's full sensor array, caused the Central Authorities' emergency session to recess for 40 minutes while various officials argued about whether the count was accurate. It was. The Dominion's entire active military force numbered approximately 2,000 vessels. Earth had deployed 817 ships to a single debris field in the outer frontier zone. But the ships had not fired. The Dominion's Strategic Analysis Division ran 412 simulations of the scenario in the next 18 hours, trying to determine what humanity intended. 391 simulations concluded the fleet would initiate offensive action within 72 hours. 14 concluded they would hold position and negotiate. 7 returned results that the simulation software flagged as asterisk input error, outcome not consistent with known strategic patterns. An analyst named Urath pulled those 7 simulations. In all 7, humanity held position indefinitely, not as negotiation, not as threat, but as something the simulation software did not have a concept for. Urath sat with those 7 results for a long time, and then wrote a single line in his analysis report. In 7 simulation outcomes, the Terran fleet is not doing what fleets do. It is simply being witnessed. His supervisor marked the line as non-actionable speculation and moved on to the more statistically probable outcomes. Urath kept his copy. On the 19th day, Cormac Dali asked Commander Orath for a communications terminal. Orath, by this point, had stopped following standard protocols regarding the survivor. Standard protocols assumed survivors were incidental. Cormac Dali was not incidental. Orath was increasingly certain that Cormac Dali's presence aboard the Endless Patience was the most precisely engineered element of a plan that had been in motion longer than most Dominion officers had been alive. He gave him the terminal. He watched openly as Cormac sat down and pulled up a frequency Orath did not recognize, not Earth standard, not diplomatic, not military. Cormac spoke 6 words in a language that was not Terran standard and was not in the Dominion's translation database. Then he closed the terminal. "What language was that?" Orath asked. "Old Irish," Cormac said. "It's been extinct as a primary language for about 400 years. We brought it back, specifically for situations like this." Orath stared at him. "You developed a dead language as an encryption protocol." "We didn't develop it, we kept it alive, quietly. Took about 150 years of cultural program funding." Cormac almost smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Turned out to be useful. "What did you say in it?" Cormac looked at the terminal. "I told them the count was confirmed, 11. Orath thought about that number again. 11 ships in the expansion protocol fleet that had destroyed the colonies. 11. "You were providing a target inventory," Orath said. "I was providing a confirmation." Cormac looked at him steadily. "There's a difference. We already knew the inventory." The 11 ships of the expansion protocol fleet were not stationed at the debris field. They had moved on after classification to their next survey targets, spread across 4 different systems. Standard procedure. No communication between them after dispersal. They were each found over the following 9 hours, with their drive systems offline. Not destroyed, not boarded, not harmed. Drives simply ceased to function simultaneously across 4 systems in a coordinated action that the Dominion's engineering division would spend 2 years failing to fully explain. Each vessel drifted, intact, crewed, perfectly safe, unable to move. A message was received by each crew simultaneously. It was brief, and it was in standard Vorath, and it said, "You will be collected. Until then, please remain calm. We have found that patience is a skill worth practicing." The message was signed, Terran Recovery Coordination, Office of Administrative Remediation. There were Dominion officials who, upon receiving this information, concluded humanity had just committed an act of war. There were others who concluded humanity had just demonstrated a military intelligence capacity that redefined every existing threat assessment in the Central Authorities database. There were a small number who sat quietly with the message for a long time and thought about the phrase Office of Administrative Remediation. Thought about a delegation traveling across the galaxy with approved emergency hearing paperwork. Thought about a woman sitting in a waiting room. Thought about what it meant that humanity had named the office that immobilized 11 Dominion warships after the exact bureaucratic department that had failed to process their territorial complaint. It was not coincidence. Nothing about this had ever been coincidence. Director Tuilagi was still in the waiting room when the senior remediation officer came to find her personally, which had never, in the recorded history of the department, occurred before. She was reading something on a handheld device. She did not look up when he approached. Director Tuilagi, the officer said. His skin pattern was cycling through colors so rapidly it was almost incoherent Vorath for extreme emotional dysregulation. We have received developments. I know, she said. The fleet. I know. The 11 vessels. I know that too. He stood in front of her, his skin still cycling. She continued reading. Director, he said carefully, what do you want? She looked up then. She closed the handheld device. She looked at him with an expression his cultural training offered no template for, not triumph, not grief, not anger. Something much older than any of those. I want a hearing, she said. I want the Dominion to formally acknowledge that 143,612 of my people are dead because of a late filing. I want the record to reflect that. I want every civilization in this galaxy that trades with, treaties with, or fears the Dominion to have access to that record. The officer's skin settled into the colorless white of genuine fear. And the fleet. The fleet will wait. For how long? Tuilagi stood up. She was, Orath would later note in his report, not a physically imposing individual by any cross-species standard. She was average height, average build, 53 years old, carrying the slight weight distribution of someone who had spent most of the last year in low gravity. She looked, by every metric the Dominion used to assess threat level, like no threat at all. The Kepler famine lasted 4 months, she said. I was 7 years old. We had no rescue contact for the first 31 days. She picked up her bag. We have significant practice, Director, with waiting. She walked to the hearing room. He followed. The hearing lasted 6 days. On the second day, Commander Orath transmitted a request to the Central Authority, not operational, personal, asking to be present at the conclusion. It was denied on procedural grounds. On the third day, Cormac Dolly asked to use the communications terminal again. Orath didn't ask him what he said. On the fourth day, the Dominion's Cultural Assessment Division formally upgraded humanities classification from Class C to an emergency internal review status that had been used only once before in Dominion history. For a civilization that had subsequently become the Dominion's most significant military ally, after a conflict that lasted 40 years and reshaped the borders of known space. On the fifth day, Orath sat across from Cormac Dolly in the medical bay and asked the question he had been carrying since the beginning. How many of you survived, actually survived, not just Frontier Zone, the entire engagement? Cormac was quiet. I need to understand what we cost you, Orath said, what this actually cost. The honesty in the question seemed to land on Cormac differently than anything prior. His composure, which had held through 19 days of interrogation and observation and custody, aboard a vessel that had been in the fleet that killed his world, shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like tectonic plates. Something rearranging under an enormous weight it had been carrying long enough that the bearing had become load-bearing structure. 143,612, he said, plus 4 in the intercept operations. Orath absorbed that, plus 4. We lost 4 people bringing those 11 ships offline. One of them was 22 years old. She'd been training for that specific operation since she was 14. The room was quiet for a long time. That is why you sing, Orath said, not a question. Cormac looked at him. In the debris field, you were singing. She was singing, Cormac said. Aof, on the way back from the colony when the attack began, she sang when she was terrified. He looked at his hands. I just kept doing it after, because it felt like, I don't know, like if it stopped, the last sound she ever made would be gone too. Orath had no category for this. Not biologically, not culturally, not philosophically. He sat with it in the way the fleet had sat in the debris field, simply present with something that could not be managed, only witnessed. "I'm sorry," he said. Cormac looked at him for a long time. "I know," he said. "I believe you. That's the problem, isn't it? That doesn't change anything. That's the part your remediation department doesn't seem to understand. Sorry doesn't rebuild what was there." On the 6th day, the Dominion Central Authority issued a formal judgment. It acknowledged administrative error. It acknowledged the deaths. It issued full territorial recognition of all former frontier zone coordinates. It established a reparations framework of genuinely staggering scope, material, logistical, developmental. It also, in a section of the document that had no formal precedent in Dominion treaty law, formally recognized that humanity possessed what the document called undeclared defensive capacity of strategic consequence, and requested a formal military liaison framework for. And this was the language the document actually used: mutual awareness and transparent escalation prevention. Translated from diplomatic Vorath, the Dominion was asking humanity to please inform them, in the future, of what they were capable of, so that no one made any more expensive mistakes. Director Tuilagi reviewed the document for 40 minutes. Her legal team reviewed it for 6 hours. She signed it. The hearing chamber was nearly empty when the signing concluded. Most officials had gone. Tuilagi sat alone at the long table, the document in front of her, looking at nothing in particular. A junior clerk approached to collect the documentation. He paused, looking at her expression. "Director," he said carefully, "is there something else?" She looked at the document. 143,616, she said. "I'm sorry. The official count is 612, but 4 more died in the operation that held those ships in place." She smoothed the edge of the document with one finger. "I want the record amended." The clerk stood there for a moment. It was an authorized. "I want their names in the record," she said, "not as operational assets, not as personnel engaged in tactical response, as people with their homeworlds listed." She finally looked up at him. "One of them was 22 years old. She deserves to be named." The clerk nodded slowly. "I'll make the notation." Tuilagi stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked around the chamber, at the ceilings and walls and windows, with the same quiet measuring attention that had unsettled the escort officer on her first day. She walked out without looking at the document again. The fleet remained in holding position for 4 more days, while the reparation terms were transmitted, verified, and accepted by the Terran government. During that time, Commander Oreth stayed in communication with Cormac Dolly, not officially, personally. On the final day, he asked a question he had been building toward since the medical bay. If the hearing had failed, he said, if the Dominion had refused, what were the orders? Cormac was quiet for a moment. The fleet would have held position, he said. And held it. Oreth waited. We didn't build those ships to fight, Cormac said. We built them to be seen, to make the cost of continuing the mistake visible. He paused. If it had come to fighting, we would have fought. But we built 80 years of strategic planning around hopping it wouldn't, because even winning would have cost us things we couldn't get back. He looked at Oreth directly. We're very good at understanding what we can't get back. The fleet began moving toward the frontier zone coordinates the following morning, not in military formation, but in the distributed pattern of an engineering and construction force, because that was what most of the 817 ships actually were. Builders, terraforming vessels, colonial support ships, carrying the materials and personnel to begin the work of reconstruction. 312 of them were warships. The Dominion's Strategic Analysis Division had classified all 817 as military threats. Urath, the analyst who had written the line about humanity simply being witnessed, pulled the original fleet manifest that was shared with the Dominion as part of the Liaison Framework Agreement. He spent a long time with it. Then he went back to his 7 anomalous simulations. He found that in all 7, the simulation software had correctly identified the non-military vessels, had classified them accurately, had simply assumed they were support vessels for the warships, because no civilization in the simulation database had ever deployed a rebuilding force at the same time and in the same formation as a military deterrent. He wrote a new line in his analysis report. They came to remember what was lost and rebuild what could be rebuilt, simultaneously with demonstrating what would happen if it happened again. In our records, these are 3 separate operations conducted in sequence. For humanity, they appear to be a single thought. His supervisor read this one, did not mark it as non-actionable, shared it instead with the Central Authority's Long-Range Strategic Planning Division, where it sat in a file for 11 years before anyone fully understood what it meant. Cormac Dolly was transferred to a Terran vessel on the 4th day. Commander Oreth saw him off at the docking bay. It was not protocol. Oreth was not entirely sure why he went. Cormac shook his hand, the Terran physical greeting gesture, which Voreth found anatomically unusual, and then stopped before boarding. "There's a song," he said, "the one I was singing." "Galway Bay," Oreth said. Cormac looked at him, slightly surprised. "You looked it up." "I did." "The original was written by a man who had lost everything he remembered about home," Cormac said. "Exile, the entire culture of loss and displacement that the song comes from, it's thousands of years old. We've been singing about losing home since before we could get off one rock in one star system." He looked back at the docking corridor. "We've been practicing that particular grief for a very long time. We got good at surviving it." He looked back at Orath. "That's what your people never put in the database, the thing you kept classifying as emotional damage." He boarded. The bay door closed. Orath stood there for a moment. He thought about 44 case studies of civilizations processing catastrophic loss through petition and protest and generational healing. He thought about a 7-year-old girl keeping 11 children alive for 31 days in a collapsed storage structure. He thought about a 22-year-old whose name he still didn't know, singing on her way to an operation she had been training for since she was 14. He thought about 80 years of construction, planning, waiting, hoping it would not be needed. He thought about the word *remediation. He thought about the singing in the debris field, carrying across dead space to sensors calibrated for nothing like it. He filed his final report on the Endless Patience's * survey mission. Under the field labeled * threat assessment, Terran civilization, * he typed for a long time, deleted what he had written twice, and finally settled on a single sentence. Threat level does not apply. Standard threat assessment frameworks assume a ceiling on willingness to pay cost. Terran civilization does not appear to have one. He submitted it. The Dominion's Central Authority received it, classified it, and forwarded it to the Xenological Studies Institute, where it joined Urath's report and eventually became part of a broader academic conversation about classification methodology. In practical policy terms, it changed nothing immediately. It changed everything eventually. Years later, when the Dominion's formal alliance with the Terran Frontier Reconstruction Authority was 20 years old and the rebuilt colonies were a generation deep in their second flourishing, a Voreth academic named Leth published a study on the engagement. It was largely historical by then, cited in universities, discussed in strategy seminars. The basic facts were known. What Leth focused on in the chapter that became the most widely read and least comfortably digested was not the fleet, not the treaty, not the reparations. It was the singing. Leth had located the original acoustic recording from the Endless Patience sensor logs filed still, after all this time, under asterisk instrument malfunction, pending review. She had pulled it, cleared the classification, and listened to it in full. She wrote about it for 3 pages before arriving at the question she had been circling. What species sings in the debris field of their own civilization's destruction? What psychology produces that response to annihilation? What does it mean that the singing was not performed for comfort, not performed as distress signal, not performed as grief ritual, but performed, according to the survivor's own account, because it was the last sound someone beloved had made, and stopping felt like a second death? We classified humanity as Class C. We revised to emergency review. We signed a treaty and built an alliance and have 40 years of shared strategic history. And I'm not sure any of those categories touch what we actually encountered in that debris field. The strongest civilizations in this galaxy survive because they are powerful. The cleverest survive because they are intelligent. The most durable survive because they are numerous. Humanity survived because they made a decision not biological, not evolutionary, not strategic, a decision, chosen and renewed and chosen again, across thousands of years of exile and famine and loss and fire, that the grief of what had been lost was not a reason to stop. That it was instead a reason. I do not know what to call a species that transforms loss into will. I have searched the entire classification database. We don't have a word for it. We probably